An original from Story Studio Network.
Welcome to the Fatigue Fixer podcast. Have you ever wondered why you and most of the women you know seem tired so much of the time? Well, this is the podcast where we explore why. I'm your host, Dr. Sarah Vedboncoeur. I'm a naturopathic doctor, hockey and baseball mom, bookworm, and nerd at heart who's fascinated by the state of modern women's health and well-being. I've had the privilege of treating thousands of women in my practice over the past 14 years, and hearing your stories has taught me an important lesson. Women are incredibly strong, resilient, and self-aware. And yet, too many of us are struggling to show up fully in our lives because we're tired and unwell. I want you to have the energy you need to share your unique gifts with the world because we are in desperate need of more female leadership. So join me for conversations that will help you feel less alone, more informed about all the things that might be draining your energy, and inspired to fix your fatigue and wake up every morning feeling rested and excited for the day ahead. I can't wait to share today's episode with you. So let's get into it. Welcome back to the Fatigue Fixer. If you've been here for a little while, you know that we did an episode last year about how oatmeal was killing you. Obviously, it wasn't actually killing you, but we talked about trends in the wellness space that are just outrageous. And one of the big ones last year was that oatmeal was the worst thing for you and causing all kinds of problems. Well, this year, the boogeyman is cortisol. I cannot open my Instagram feed without being fed a million videos about cortisol. And there's so much nonsense happening around cortisol that I just needed to do an episode so we can set the record straight about what is actually happening with cortisol, what it is, what it's doing, whether or not coffee impacts it, and really how worried we should be about cortisol and whether it actually is the cause of all of our problems, as Instagram would have you believe. One of the things that I want to encourage you to think about is that anytime we start blaming one specific thing for a whole bunch of problems, that should be a red flag, right? If we all of a sudden are assuming that cortisol is causing all of our different health problems, that should be a red flag. Our bodies are so incredibly complex. It's very, very rare that there's going to be one hormone or one nutrient or one thing that is causing everything to fall apart. And what I hope you take away from today's conversation is that cortisol is not the enemy. Despite what the internet would have us believe, our bodies are incredibly wise. They don't make a lot of mistakes. They usually have very good reasons for why they do the things they do. And the reason we have cortisol and the reason we make cortisol is to keep us alive. I don't know about you, but that's kind of a top goal of mine, is to stay alive first and foremost. And cortisol is a big part of what has allowed you to do that. So let's chat about why we are making cortisol and what's happening when there's a stress response. When your brain perceives a stress, any type of stress, almost instantaneously, there is a reaction where you are going to make epinephrine, which is also known as adrenaline. And this happens within a split second, which is why people can see a car coming toward them. And even before their brain has really registered what's happened, they literally jump off the sidewalk. Like, it's literally instantaneous. When your body sees that there's a threat, there's an almost instantaneous release of epinephrine hormones. And what that epinephrine does is it raises your heart rate, it raises your blood sugar, it raises your blood pressure, and it dilates your lungs so you can literally jump and run and get the hell out of there. So there's this very specific reason why those hormones are being released, because they're getting you into that fight or flight mode so you can react to that stress. There's also a change in blood flow that makes you more alert so you can know what's going on and make a good decision. And it also decreases your digestive system so you don't poop your pants. And it also reduces urine output so you don't pee your pants. That's what's happening literally within a split second. Like before you even are able to think that something stressful is about to happen or has happened, this has already all happened in your body. That's how amazing your body is. It's literally getting you ready before you even realize something is bad. The second step that happens as part of our stress response is that we activate something called the HPA axis. Now that stands for hypothalamus, which is in your brain, pituitary gland, also in your brain, and adrenal gland. So within a few seconds after the stress happens, this second part gets activated, the HPA. And this is when cortisol gets released. Again, cortisol is there to help you deal with and survive whatever that stress is. So what happens when we release cortisol is that we get more salt and water retention by the kidneys. Again, our blood pressure goes up. We have less insulin sensitivity. We have less thyroid hormone, and we have less immune responses. And the reason that all of these things are happening is that your body is prioritizing what's important. What is important in that moment is not that you can digest your lunch and have good blood sugar balance. It's not that you can fight off that virus that your kid brought home. Those things are irrelevant to your body in that moment. What is important is that your heart rate and your blood sugar and your lungs and your muscles and your brain are all highly alert and highly functional, so that, again, you can run or fight or move out of the way and do whatever you need to do. This is an extremely intelligent, intricate system. And again, the reason your body's doing all of this is to help you survive, which is a good thing. I hope by now you've realized that what dictates this whole process is your brain. So while we get super hyper focused on cortisol, your body isn't just making cortisol because it feels like it. Your body is making cortisol because your brain has started the process, which tells your adrenal glands to make cortisol. So when we think about who's in charge of the stress response, it is the brain. And the brain is constantly receiving signals from the outside and from inside your body. So it's looking at things like your circadian rhythm. It's looking at your appetite, your body temperature, your blood sugar levels, how hydrated or dehydrated you are, as well as what's happening outside around you, and looking at how much of a threat is going on. So it takes all of that information, again, all the things happening inside, maybe your low blood sugar because you skipped lunch, and maybe you haven't drank enough water and you're a little bit dehydrated, and then a really stressful email hits your inbox. And all of those things come together, and your brain is basically looking at, like, what is the level of threat happening, right? It's constantly doing this threat assessment because it wants to know when it needs to deploy that reaction to have you make cortisol when that's needed. So it's constantly scanning and assessing how high the level of threat is. Now, I want you to notice what was not on the list that I just talked about. Coffee was not on the list. Cardio was not on the list. Now, we're going to come back to that. So again, your brain is in charge of this whole stress response, and it is activating cortisol based on perceiving a high level of threat. So when we look at what's actually normal for cortisol, and I asked you guys on Instagram, I said, I'm preparing an episode on cortisol, send me your questions, and you did. So some of them are in this episode. And the first one was, how do I know if I have good cortisol? Well, to know if you have good cortisol, I think it would be helpful to know what's actually normal. Like, what does a healthy, unstressed person have in terms of cortisol? So cortisol follows what we call a diurnal or daily rhythm. When you are still sleeping in the early morning hours, your cortisol starts to go up. That is part of what helps to eventually wake you up. And when you open your eyes in the morning, we trigger something called the cortisol awakening response. And basically what that is that within the first 30 minutes of you being awake, there's going to be a massive rise in cortisol. So up to a 50% increase in cortisol from your eyes opening up and being exposed to light. And this is something you want. You want your cortisol to go up in the morning because this is what helps you wake up. It is what helps you get out of bed. It is what helps you have the energy you need to get up and start your day. And the reason we have this cortisol awakening response, right? The reason we have this like spike in cortisol in the morning is because waking up is technically the first mini stress test of the day, right? I know a lot of us struggle with that first stress test of the day because getting up is hard. And cortisol is actually helping you to get out of bed and do the things that you need to do. So one of the questions that I was asked is, how do I avoid the morning cortisol spike? And this question to me just illustrates how bad the conversation is online, because you don't want to avoid a morning cortisol spike. That is actually a healthy cortisol rhythm that your cortisol should go up when you wake up. You don't want to not have that cortisol spike in the morning. So again, when you wake up, you're going to get a big spike of cortisol within about 30 minutes. And then once you've been up for an hour, it's going to go kind of back down close to where it was when you woke up. And then your cortisol gradually drops throughout the day. And it really starts to get low when it's dark out, because when it's dark out, this is when we start to make melatonin. And when we talk about cortisol, we really can't talk about cortisol without talking about melatonin, because they are opposite hormones. So I always explain cortisol is like the sun. It rises in the morning and then it slowly comes down throughout the day. Melatonin is like the moon. It comes up when it's dark. You're going to get lots of melatonin overnight when you're sleeping. And then when you get up in the morning and the sun comes up, the moon goes away, right? Your melatonin goes away. So these two hormones are so intricately connected, which you'll understand a little bit more when we talk about what you can do to really help have good cortisol balance. That's what we want, is that big morning spike, slowly coming down, and then very low by the time you go to bed. So how do I know if I have this? Like, how do I know if there's cortisol is wrong, or if there's a problem with my cortisol? So some of the symptoms that you might notice are going to be fatigue or lack of motivation. A lot of people will find that they have a harder time coping with daily stress. They're more likely to have higher levels of things like anxiety and depression. Your mood can be impaired. You can have sleep disturbances because, again, if you have high cortisol when you're going to bed, when you should be having low cortisol, that can make it hard for you to fall asleep. If you get a big spike of cortisol in the middle of the night because your stress levels are high or because your blood sugar dropped, actually, that can also cause you to wake up in the night. So blood sugar and cortisol are intricately connected. For some women, cortisol imbalance will cause menstrual changes, or even for some women losing their cycle altogether. It can affect your immune function. Like I talked about earlier, when your brain and your body are in that stress response, they don't care that you cut your finger the other day. Like, they're not trying to heal the cut on your finger, because again, that's not going to help you survive in the moment. They're not trying to get you to fight the virus again that your kid brought home. That's not helping you in the moment. Your body's really prioritized on what's going to help me right now. And those things are not important right now. You'll also notice cognitive changes such as forgetfulness. You might have trouble concentrating. You might start making more mistakes at work. That happened to me yesterday. I completely misread someone's phone number and dialed a random number, and it was just a silly mistake. Some people find that they use more substances, so they might reach for more alcohol or cigarettes. And then there can be changes in appetite and weight. And this is the part of the conversation that is very, very prominent online, is this idea of cortisol belly, and that if you can't lose weight, it's because of cortisol. So let's chat about the relationship between our weight and cortisol. So cortisol has been shown to stimulate appetite. It for sure can make you hungrier, and it's more likely going to make you hungry for things that are high in carbohydrates and things that are high in fat. And so what cortisol can do is it can cause you to overeat and to have a preference for calorie-dense foods, which can for sure contribute to weight gain over time. Where I think the conversation is getting a little bit muddied is that a lot of people online are giving the impression that cortisol itself is directly causing weight gain. Cortisol can't cause weight gain if there isn't an addition of calories, right? A hormone itself doesn't necessarily just cause weight gain, but it can cause overeating. So for sure, in that sense, cortisol can be contributing to some of the weight gain, but it's not just because you have high cortisol. It's because the high cortisol is affecting your appetite and your behaviors. And over time, that's probably causing some weight gain. We also know that cortisol can make us more resistant to leptin. So leptin is the hormone that lets us know we're full. When we have leptin resistance, which a lot of people do, especially if you're overweight or obese, we know that people with obesity are much more likely to be leptin resistant. It's harder for you to know that you're full. You're going to need more food to feel full. You're going to feel hungry more often. And so cortisol is contributing to that. So again, if you have leptin resistance and you always feel hungry, you're going to have a harder time keeping your weight down. You're going to be driven to eat more. And then it also impacts insulin and can contribute to more insulin resistance, which can affect how your body metabolizes sugar and can certainly promote fat storage in the abdominal area. So again, there definitely is a link between cortisol and weight. And certainly it's not untrue that cortisol can increase fat storage in our abdomen. But again, this is not going to happen unless there's also some kind of calorie excess. So it's not the hormones just on their own causing these issues. Again, they're affecting your behaviors and your eating patterns, and those can contribute to weight gain. And then we have good old cortisol face. I don't know if you've ever seen a cortisol face video. Sadly, my algorithm sends me them all the time. And if you are not familiar with cortisol face, it is basically a swollen face that makes your face very round, like the moon. And I think what's happened here is that we've kind of borrowed from conditions where there really is high cortisol. So one of the conditions we'll talk about in a moment is Cushing's disease or Cushing's syndrome. Cushing's disease is a condition where people make enormous amounts of cortisol. And that is one of the symptoms, is this, we call it moon face, because their face is very, very round. So now there is this trend that if your face is too round, we're blaming it on cortisol and we're calling it cortisol face. And this is a sign that your cortisol is high. Now, I think that's a bit of a stretch for most of us, because as we'll talk about shortly, most of us don't actually have massive problems with cortisol. And the other thing I kept thinking about is like round face compared to what, right? So a lot of people that we're also seeing online, their faces are filtered, their faces are Botoxed, their faces are fillered. And a lot of people have Ozempic face, which is the opposite of cortisol face. It's a very slim, often kind of gaunt looking face. So do people have cortisol face, or do they just have a round normal face compared to all the other maybe slimmer faces? So there's no evidence right now that cortisol face is real, other than people who have Cushing's, which we'll talk about is extremely rare. But certainly it can happen for people who have hypothyroidism, for people who have Cushing's, and for people who use prednisone, which is basically a medication that is cortisol. When we look at, again, like what is cortisol actually doing, it is having some impacts. It's unlikely that it's like the main cause of all your problems. But there are times when things can get very, very wrong. Like things can go wrong with cortisol. And so there's a couple of conditions we'll talk about. The first one is Cushing's, which I just alluded to. So Cushing's is a condition where the body makes really, really high amounts of cortisol. This is an extremely rare condition. So it affects somewhere between 0.7 to 2.4 people per million people per year. So this is not a common condition. And the most common reason why people would have Cushing's is they have a mass in their pituitary. So remember how we talked about HPA? H is your hypothalamus in your brain. It sends a signal to your pituitary, and then your pituitary talks to your adrenal gland. So what happens with this is there's a mass on the pituitary, and that mass is telling the adrenal glands to just keep pumping out cortisol. So you end up with these massive amounts of cortisol. And women are more likely to be affected. And it's often going to show up between age 20 and 50. So we definitely need to do a better job of screening people for Cushing's and diagnosing them. But it is a rare condition. The vast majority of us are not actually walking around with super high levels of cortisol. And then we have the flip side, which is something called Addison's disease. So Addison's is also extremely rare. Again, something like 2.4 people per million are getting this. And this is where the body actually makes very little cortisol. You're actually making very, very little amounts of cortisol. And this can happen to people after they stop taking medications like prednisone. So if you took prednisone, which is like a synthetic cortisol, for a long time, and all of a sudden you stop taking it, this could happen. But the most likely reason that people would have very low cortisol or Addison's is usually because there's an autoimmune condition that's basically damaging the adrenal glands. So those are two conditions that have very real, very measurable problems with cortisol. But again, they're very rare. This is not what the average person is dealing with. Then we come to adrenal fatigue, which is a term that I certainly used in the past. It's a term that certainly came up when I was going through my training, and it's a term that gets thrown around in the wellness space. It's not a real condition. So a lot of times when we're talking about adrenal fatigue, the idea is that your adrenal glands, if you're under stress for a long period of time, your adrenal glands get kind of tired and then they stop making cortisol. That doesn't happen. Your adrenal glands don't get tired. We wouldn't have lasted very long if our adrenal glands got tired when they were stressed out. It's not a real condition, and that's not what happens. What can happen is that when you have an initial stress, so when stress is kind of fresh or short-termed, you'll get, again, this big rise of cortisol, which we talked about earlier, which again is part of a normal stress response. It's what you want. It helps you survive. And then hopefully, in an ideal world, you get lots of time to relax and recover after the stress, and the cortisol levels come right back down, right? That's what this stress response is for. And part of what I think we forget is that it's not the activation of the stress response that's harmful. It's that modern living completely loses sight of the recovery period. So we get constant activation of the stress response, and we usually don't have enough of that rest and recovery for things to come back to baseline. So with adrenal fatigue, the idea was if you activate your cortisol too many times, you kind of run out and then you can't make cortisol. That's not what happens. What can happen is that if your brain is constantly perceiving stress and it keeps pumping out all of this cortisol, that cortisol takes a toll. So like we talked about, that cortisol is doing a lot of great things to help you in your immediate survival. It's not great long-term for your digestion. It's not great long-term for your metabolism. It's not great long-term for your hormones and your reproductive system. So eventually the brain may say, okay, there's still stress going on, but we're paying a big, big cost for having all this cortisol. So I'm actually going to tell the adrenal glands to maybe lay off making so much cortisol. So it's not that the adrenals get tired and run out. It's, again, the brain is in charge. The brain is telling the adrenals what to do. The adrenals they don't have a mind of their own. They can't just pump out cortisol because they feel like it. They're constantly just waiting for the brain to tell them what to do. All that to say, if someone tells you that you have adrenal fatigue, I would question that. Again, it's not a real diagnosis, and I am fully disclosing I used to throw this word around until I learned better. It's not a real condition. We need to stop using that word. Now, cortisol imbalances, or HPA, again, the stress response, is associated with all kinds of different health concerns. So there are certain things that may make you have a more active HPA, meaning you're more likely to go through that stress response, and the end product being that you're making cortisol. So some of the things that are going to activate your stress response and make you make cortisol are things like chronic stress, anorexia, OCD, which is obsessive compulsive disorder, panic disorders, diabetes, hyperthyroidism, and pregnancy. It doesn't mean that these conditions are caused by high cortisol. We just know that they're connected. Those conditions we're more likely to see high cortisol. There are other conditions where we're more likely to see decreased activation of the stress response and potentially lower cortisol levels. And that includes things like chronic fatigue syndrome, fibromyalgia, when you're postpartum, PTSD, hypothyroidism, and rheumatoid arthritis. Cortisol is going to be involved in these things, and we'll talk more in a moment about kind of where that connection might come from. We've so far talked about how cortisol is not the enemy. It's there for a reason, which is to help you survive. It's made because your brain told your adrenal glands to make it. And it's actually very rare that people have overt problems with cortisol. Like, it's actually rare that people have way too much cortisol. So what is actually affecting cortisol? If we don't have Cushing's and we don't have Addison's and we don't have adrenal fatigue, because that doesn't actually exist, what are the things that are actually impacting our cortisol? What can we actually do to encourage healthy cortisol release and healthy cortisol balance? So there's 4 things that we're going to talk about that are in your control. The first one is your perceived stress. So what's super interesting about stress is that it's not the event that determines whether it's stressful or not. It is how you perceive it. And public speaking is a perfect example. For some people, a lot of people, public speaking is a massive stress. For me, if you put me on a stage, I am happy. Like, yes, my heart rate might go up because it's like exciting and nerve-wracking, but I love being up there. So again, it's not the event itself. Events are not stress. The stress is your body perceiving that you do not have the resources to deal with whatever that thing is. It's not about the actual event. And there's an acronym that I just learned that I loved, which is NUTS. NUTS is how we're going to think about perceived stress. And there are 4 things that are going to increase most people's perceived stress. So NUTS stands for the novelty of the event. How new is it? If you've never done something before, you're more likely, like when I started podcasting, that was stressful because I had never done that before. 2 is the unpredictable nature of the event. Our brain loves control, or the illusion of control. Our brain loves predictability. So as soon as something is unpredictable, we don't like that. That's stressful for most of us. 3rd is the perceived threat to your physical body or ego. So I love this because there are stresses where it's literally like our physical, like we're in physical danger. But think of how stressful it is when there is something that might make you embarrassed or have people realize that you're not as good as whatever you think you are. So as soon as we think there's a threat to our ego or our physical body, that increases perceived stress. And then the last one is a sense of loss of control. Again, we love control. We love the illusion of control. When that is taken away, we get really stressed. Managing your level of perceived stress is going to be one of the best things you can do to help regulate cortisol. The second thing is your circadian disruption. The number one thing that is going to determine your cortisol is light exposure. It's not coffee, it's not cardio, it's not HIIT, it's not salty electrolytes in the morning, it's light. So again, remember, cortisol is like the sun, melatonin is like the moon. The number one thing that is going to regulate your cortisol is proper light exposure. We want to make sure that we are being exposed to sunlight during the morning and in the daytime, and shielding ourselves from bright light in the evening and having more darkness in the evening. And as soon as those things get disrupted by technology and modern living, or if you have sleep issues and your circadian rhythm gets thrown off, or you do shift work, that's going to have a huge impact, or can have a huge impact on your cortisol. Number 3, glycemic dysregulation, aka your blood sugar. So cortisol impacts your blood sugar and vice versa. One of the things, and I said this earlier, when cortisol goes up, one of the things it does is it raises your blood sugar because it is getting your body ready to literally have the energy to run away or fight. The problem is most of us don't do any of that. We sit at our desk and we keep typing away. So there's literally nowhere for that sugar to go because we're not actually moving when we have a stress response. And this is one of the reasons that chronic stress can increase your risk of having blood sugar issues, because those stress hormones bring your blood sugar back up and then you don't move, you don't do anything. You literally just sit there and keep being stressed out. some of the things that we want to think about specifically around blood sugar balance and cortisol is regular meal times. I talk about this all the time. I am team breakfast. I don't like fasting. I like regular meal times. For most people, they really help with blood sugar. They help with appetite. You want to be eating regular meals. Again, your brain is scanning the environment, right? So if you haven't eaten in like 5 hours, your blood sugar is starting to drop a little bit, and your body has no idea whether or not you're going to eat, that's going to increase its stress, right? So if your body never knows when lunch is coming, maybe some days lunch is at 11, some days it's at 2, some days there is no lunch because, I got too busy. Just think about the stress that that's putting on your brain. So one of the easiest ways to reduce your stress load is literally just to eat regular meals. Just let your body and your brain know we're going to have breakfast around this time, lunch around that time, and dinner at this time. And it's like one less thing that your brain has to worry about. We want to make sure those meals are balanced, ideally with fiber and protein and good carbs. We want to be mindful about stress eating. And we also, if we are not moving, I just said this earlier, if you are not moving because you sit at a desk all day like I do and like many of us do, you're going to have worse blood sugar balance. And that blood sugar is having an impact on your cortisol and your stress response. So again, it goes both ways. If you manage your stress better, you will have better blood sugar response. And if you have better blood sugar management, you're less likely to trigger a stress reaction. So blood sugar is so important on this. And then fourth, inflammation and inflammatory signals. One of the things that most people don't realize about cortisol, because again, we've labeled it as this horrific, bad, terrible hormone. Cortisol is a powerful anti-inflammatory. This is why when someone has an inflammatory condition, we usually give them cortisone, right? If you have eczema, we give you cortisone cream. If you have a massive infection or a big reaction, you might get a cortisone nasal spray. You might get prednisone, which is oral cortisone. So it's a potent anti-inflammatory. So anytime there is inflammation in your body wants to try to get rid of that inflammation. What is one of the fastest ways to bring down inflammation? Release cortisol. So if you have an inflammatory condition, whether it's a digestive condition like Crohn's or colitis, maybe you have arthritis, if you have cardiovascular disease, if you have obesity, if you have any kind of allergic conditions like eczema, like we talked about, or allergies. My poor partner right now, as we record this, is dying of seasonal allergies. So if you have lots of allergies, like that's triggering an inflammatory response. If you have an infection, all of those things raise inflammation. And again, when we raise inflammation, your body's going to make cortisol to try to just calm everything down. If you are truly interested in having better cortisol or a more balanced cortisol rhythm, those are the 4 things I would think about. Again, number 1 would be reducing your perceived stress. Number 2 would be not effing up your circadian rhythm by getting good sleep, getting light, not looking at your phone at 3 a.m. Number 3, making sure you have good blood sugar balance. And number 4, dealing with any type of inflammatory condition that you might have. So again, notice what was not on that list. What is not causing high cortisol, despite what the interweb has to say? Coffee. There is this really weird trend. I literally just saw this because the algorithm is always listening to me. I was fed a video today of this woman saying, I don't drink coffee in the first hour after waking because I don't want to spike my cortisol. Here's what I want to say to that. Number 1, your cortisol is going to spike in the morning, whether or not you drink coffee, because it has nothing to do with coffee. It has to do with the cortisol awakening response. And again, you want that because it helps you to wake up and have energy and start your day. We have specifically looked at coffee. If you are a regular coffee drinker, like I am, you could drink up to 7 cups of coffee a day and it would have no impact on your cortisol. So if you have been delaying or avoiding morning coffee because you're afraid of what it's doing to cortisol, the great news is you can stop that nonsense because it is not making any difference. It's probably raising your stress because if you're anything like me, you love your morning coffee and now you're trying to wait an hour before you have it, which sucks. So you don't need to do that. Now, if you are someone who has never had coffee in your life and you drink the equivalent of somewhere between 4 to 7 cups of coffee in the morning, then yes, your cortisol will go up. Now, I'm guessing most people listening are not never coffee drinkers who plan to wake up and have 7 cups of coffee. So if that's not your plan, just stop worrying about coffee. I'm like so fed up of this weird conversation against coffee. Coffee is good for you. It makes life wonderful. We have so much research. It's a great source of antioxidants. We know it helps with blood sugar control. It helps with metabolic function. It helps with neurological disease. So I am team coffee. Please don't be afraid of coffee. It is not causing high cortisol. Let's just put a cross on that. We're not doing that. That's not true. Number 2, cardio and HIIT. So there's also a lot of conversation around women can't lose weight because they're doing too much cardio, or you can't lose weight because you're doing the wrong kind of exercise, or you can't lose weight because your cortisol is too high. Cardio and exercise, any type of exercise, whatever type of exercise you do, is a stress. And therefore, it will temporarily raise your cortisol just like any other stress will. The good thing with exercise is that your cortisol will come right back down. And when we look at people who exercise regularly, they have better stress management and they have better cortisol production. So if you have stopped doing your spin class or your HIIT or your CrossFit because you were afraid that it was blocking weight loss or that it was spiking your cortisol, you do not need to worry about that. And part of why this conversation angers me so much is that in Canada, only 38% of women meet the recommended dose of weekly exercise of 150 minutes of exercise per week. And so what is often happening when we tell women that certain types of exercise are bad for weight loss or bad for cortisol is a lot of times they just do even less. And that is the worst thing we can do for our health. And it's actually one of the worst things we can do for cortisol is to move less. So the moral of the story is cardio, HIIT, spin, they are not having any kind of significant long-term impact on your cortisol. Please do whatever type of exercise makes you happy. We need cardio. It's good for our heart and our brain and a whole bunch of other things. So please include cardio. And you are not losing weight because you're doing the wrong kind of exercise. That's nonsense. Okay, I will get off my rant about cortisol. Last thing I want to talk about is testing. And this was a question that I was asked on Instagram. How do I know if I have good cortisol levels and should I get myself tested? I will say that I rarely test cortisol in most of my patients because no matter what your cortisol is right now, I want you to do the 4 things that we talked about. I want you to look at your perceived stress. I want to make sure that you're getting enough sleep and going outside every day. I want to make sure that we're balancing blood sugar and that we're calming down inflammation. So I don't normally test cortisol because I'm going to tell you to do those things no matter what your cortisol is. Now, if you're someone who needs to see something on paper in order to take action, then in a case like that, testing your cortisol might be helpful. If seeing that you have high cortisol is going to make you go to bed on time, then by all means, you can get your cortisol tested. There's 3 ways we can check cortisol. Number 1 is through a blood test. I don't like blood test, again, because it's a snapshot. So we're literally just seeing whatever time you went for blood work, this was your cortisol. And again, because cortisol follows a diurnal rhythm, depending on what time of day it is, your cortisol is going to look completely different. So it doesn't tell you anything about whether you're making it at the right time. It just kind of tells you, do you have too much? And again, unless you have Cushing's or Addison's, your blood work's going to be normal. I've seen so many people get cortisol tested on blood. It's almost always normal. So I wouldn't waste my time with that. If you are wondering if you have too much cortisol, one of the tests that I will sometimes do is a 24-hour urine cortisol. We literally send you home with a giant plastic jug. And for 24 hours, you collect every drop of pee that comes out of your body and you put it in the jug. And they can measure how much cortisol you made in the day. So this is a really great way to just see how much cortisol you're making, especially if you're concerned about making too much. And this is the test that was the gold standard for a very long time for Cushing's, right? It's great to see if you're making too much cortisol. The gold standard would definitely be saliva testing. And the benefit with saliva testing is that we can measure your cortisol several times over the course of the day. So we can measure you when you wake up, 30 minutes later, 60 minutes later. So we can literally map out that cortisol awakening response. And then we also check you at lunchtime, dinner time, and before bed. So we can literally see, number one, are you making too much cortisol? But also, are you making cortisol at the right time? Because that's part of the conversation that's really missing, I think, around cortisol. It's not just about how much you make. It's when are you making it? Because again, it should follow this very specific pattern. And if it's not, then that may tell us that for sure something is off. My take-home messages on this very longer than I planned cortisol rant. Number one, cortisol is not the enemy. It's keeping you alive. It's here to keep you safe, and it's anti-inflammatory. You want cortisol. If you didn't have cortisol, you'd be dead. Cortisol is not the enemy. We need it. If you want better cortisol control and better cortisol balance, you need to make sure that your brain feels safe. Because again, part of what's triggering cortisol is that something made your brain feel unsafe. Maybe it was that you skipped lunch. Maybe it was that someone cut you off in traffic. So the more you can reduce that perceived threat level for your brain, the less cortisol is going to get triggered. And then you're going to focus on the 4 things that I keep harping on. You're going to reduce your perceived stress. You're going to lower your inflammation through exercise, eating whole foods diet. You're going to get morning sunshine. You're going to sleep in a really dark room at night. And you're going to balance your blood sugar by just eating breakfast, eating regular meals, having some protein and fiber, going for more walks. And for the love of God, please do not worry about having coffee in the morning. If that makes you happy and you want to have it when you wake up, please go ahead. That is not going to raise your cortisol. That's nonsense. All right. That is what I wanted to share with you, my lovely, lovely listeners, about cortisol. So I've gotten it all off my chest. I would love to hear from you. You can always come find me on Instagram. I love receiving your messages and your questions. So I would love to hear your thoughts on this episode. And I will see you right back here in 2 weeks. Bye, everybody. Thanks for spending your precious time with me today. If you enjoyed today's episode, I'd love it if you would send it to a woman in your life who needs to hear it. And there's no better way to help me reach more women who want to fix their fatigue than to take 2 minutes to leave a rating and review wherever you're listening to this. Ready to get more insight into what's making you tired? Find out which of the 5 most common types of fatigue you're dealing with by taking my fatigue fingerprint quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Are you dealing with frazzled fatigue, where your body's exhausted but your brain won't shut up, making it hard for you to fall asleep? Or maybe you're more of the drained fatigue type, where no matter how much sleep you get, you're never rested and struggle to get up in the morning. Just take my fatigue fingerprint quiz and your results will include a list of recommended labs you can ask your doctor for, as well as my top recommendations for which habits and practices are best for fixing your type of fatigue. Find the quiz at fatiguefixer.ca/quiz. Because being tired all the time isn't normal, and you deserve to have good energy. Last but not least, I want to thank Jen Hudson and Mike Trutler over at Story Studio Network for bringing these conversations to life. I'll see you right back here in 2 weeks. Bye!